Hi everyone, my name is Arto Laitinen and this talk is about three approaches to social ontology: scientific, participatory and critical approach. So, social ontology is a subfield of philosophy, and as such it shares the same standards as any subfield of philosophy, that acceptance of views or the best views are such that they should fit other best philosophical commitments. They should be compatible with other commitments that one has, or these commitments can be personal or they can be collective. This can be put aside for the purpose of this talk. In addition, they should either preserve other commitments like scientific commitments or everyday commitments and so on, or then the philosophical view should give reasons why they should be dropped, why they can't be accepted. Now, this talk will be about three sets of such commitments. Let's start with a scientific, often called naturalistic approach. The view holds that science is the measure of things. So what the best science of one's day accepts, one should accept, including its ontological commitments. On this view, so-called folk theoretical assumptions are dubious, so they should be dropped if they have no scientific backing. So the reason given for why something should be dropped here is that science doesn't need it, and we know that folk theory can be very, very much fallible. Science is fallible, of course, but folk assumptions even more so. They are kind of viewed as bad science from this scientific perspective. What I will call participatory approach doesn't accept that. It doesn't accept that only the needs of science or scientific explanation should dictate what is to be accepted in one's theory. Another set of commitments arises from what is needed, what one needs as a participant in everyday life. And what is needed or necessary in everyday life shouldn't be dropped, even if it's irrelevant for scientific explanations. So this view is explicitly against scientific naturalism. It doesn't accept the negative claim that scientific naturalism makes, that so-called folk assumptions should be dropped. On this view, these assumptions may well be necessary for participation in everyday life. It may well be, for example, that scientific theories don't need any normative truths, as it were. All the explanation can be done with the help of beliefs in some normative truths. But it may be that in participatory approach, these such things are needed, or so at least some theorists claim. We don't need to by that view, it is just here to illustrate the difference between scientific and participatory approach. The scientific approach wants to drop everything that is not necessary for science, and participatory approach says that while science, of course, is a legitimate concern, there are also other legitimate concerns that arise from our everyday lives. So these two approaches are different. But in addition, we can take a third approach, so-called critical or emancipatory approach, sometimes called critical social ontology. Central to that view is the idea that some everyday views are to be dropped because they are oppressive, dogmatic, and so on. So for the aim of emancipation, we need to revise some life-worldly assumptions, as it were. So we shouldn't be dogmatic, we shouldn't accept oppressive structures and so on. So merely limiting ourselves to the participatory approach would be wrong. So the critical approach for the purposes of normative criticism and scientific approach often share the view that they are critical of some everyday view assumptions. So the critical social ontology can be, it might not be as familiar as the other scientific and everyday views, so I'll just say a word about that. That's more or less the approach of critical social theory to the field of social ontology. And it can be thought that that's very unpromising, that often critical theory, for example, the Frankfurt School version, is critical of metaphysics. So why think that, why do critical social ontology instead of critical social theory in general? Another reason to think that this might be unpromising is that social ontology as a branch of metaphysics is about the ontological structures of social reality, and maybe they are normatively neutral, so that maybe what should guide us in our exploration of metaphysical reality is merely what there is, independently of what it is good for or bad for. But we can also think that such critical social ontology is more or less inevitable, that critical approaches in social theory do make ontological commitments, among other things. And the ontological commitments of any approach may have relevance for emancipatory aims. So to the extent that there is critical social theory, also critical social ontology may be needed. So I think that all the three approaches are legitimate ones, and this talk merely wants to add to our understanding of these different approaches. Now, I have given a whole lecture series, more or less, or seminar series on this topic, and here are just some characterizations of the three approaches to help us distinguish the three approaches. And as there's a lot of text and you can as easily read some of it, I won't be reading through all these. There are 3 or 4 slides of such characterizations, tables, where these 3 different views are characterized. So the main point that I want to say is that scientific naturalism is, it's very hard to accept its negative claims that only what is needed for science would be our guide in metaphysics or ontology, or social ontology, or metaphysics of the social world. So the rest of the talk will be merely going through some of the characterizations of the 3 approaches. One predecessor for this threefold approach is Jürgen Habermas, who distinguished between 3 knowledge interests, which echo the distinction made here. He distinguished between scientific, participatory, and critical or emancipatory interests, and saw these as guiding theory formation in social sciences. Interestingly, Amy Thomasson has made a pretty similar distinction about the function of the concept of social group. So that the idea that if we understand why we talk about social groups, then we can see what they are. And these are now my formulations, not Thomasson's. One kind of approach is to start from a scientific explanation that we want to understand the world and know that what sort of social kinds one can make generalizations within, so that they are they are natural kinds, even though they are ontologically social kinds, natural kinds in the sense that kinds within which some generalizations hold. Another function for the concept of social group comes with group agency, so we can attribute joint decisions, intentions, and responsibility to social groups, and that seems like a different usage of the idea of social group, and that fits rather well the participatory approach. And then there is the critical or emancipatory aim, that we talk about, for example, social groups or other entities in the social world in order to pursue social justice, engage in social critique, for example, in race theory or gender philosophy. For example, Sally Haslanger and Asta are examples of this kind of approach. So that there are three functions of the notion of social group, depending on what our background approach is. Different concepts of social group are needed for different purposes. Another predecessor is Sellers's distinction between scientific and manifest worldviews, and this distinction is echoed, for example, by Charles Taylor or Paul Ricoeur. So Sellars distinguishes between the scientific worldview and manifest worldview, and then thinks that the task of philosophy is to be true to both of them. Now, the critical or emancipatory approach doesn't rest content with either of those. It's kind of critical of the manifest worldview of the appearances that humans have, and so it can be said to be engaged in hermeneutics of suspicion, including ideology critique. And Max Horkheimer's distinction between traditional and critical theory illustrate the first and third of these approaches. We can then kind of go on and to different questions like, what sort of criterion of something being real is most amenable to these different approaches? It's very easy in the scientific approach to maybe hold on to the mind independence idea and maybe causal efficacy, that if something can stand in causal relations, be a cause for something, then it's real. And the inference to the best explanation is one way of thinking within this approach. By contrast, the participatory view is more easily holds that things are mind dependent but nonetheless real, if what Charles Taylor calls the best account, or David Enoch, the inference to best deliberation, holds true. For example, they would be theorists who within this approach think that values or normative properties can be real, so they are realists about those, even though they may not play any explanatory role, like I mentioned earlier. The critical or emancipatory approach adds that oppressive structures can be real, so that there can be unintentional features that are somehow indirectly dependent on intentional and point-dependent features, but they also should. So we shouldn't adopt such criterion of something being real that loses these from sight. And then in different special issues, special questions, for example, marriage, one can take one's guidance from the ontological commitments of the best science, and for example, Francesco Guala approaches marriage with the approach of the theory of equilibrium. These equilibria need not be directly visible to the participants, so there's an explanation given from the viewpoint of social science, for example, game theory or other explanations like that. This contrasts or can be contrasted with John Searle's approach to marriage, which, I mean, in my words, holds that marriage is what we think it is. There's a constitutive rule, and the participants must have the participatory understanding for there to be marriage. Their meta views, as I would put it, can be mistaken. They can think that, for example, God plays a role in marriage, even though so that even though the participants think that, it doesn't prove that God exists. That would be a kind of novel type of proof of the existence of God, which I don't think that no one would accept. But then we can have different approaches from the critical perspective. For example, Sally Haslanger has put forward this definition of a woman, which is someone who is oppressed because of reproductive organs, more or less, and then adopted to marriage. For example, Catherine Jenkins's view about ontic injustice. One example of such is concerns the that law allows marital rape, and then that if the law allows that, then this is an ontic injustice is taking place. And further, there are different sources of pluralism within these three different very broad approaches, so that actually all of them are a family of views. So this is a simplification to merely talk about three approaches. There are rival approaches in social science. There are different cultures which require different participatory culture, and the critical approach stresses that within any society, within any culture, different standpoints are different, so that it depends on your standpoint within a society how you what your participatory approach is, so that we need something behind the appearances, as it were. For example, the oppressive structures of the society, which are needed in the full picture. So we shouldn't rest content with the participatory understandings, even when we take the kind of plurality of different cultures into account. Now, Sellar's idea is that the basic ontological entities in scientific and manifest worldview differ, so that what, for example, natural science postulates is very different from what we postulate or accept when we live our everyday life, from persons to reasons, for example. Okay, I'll just move on, as I've almost used my time. Let me end with this slide, which lists some desiderata for critical social ontology in especially. Critical social ontology aims to avoid naturalization, ontologizing or biologizing what is socially constructed. For example, categories of race and gender are examples of that. It should avoid universalizing what is merely particular or contextual or specific, but it should start by getting right the specific prevailing reality. The aim is to show what is as unjust, oppressive, unfree, or containing suffering or pathologies and so on, to the full extent that it is unjust, oppressive, and so on. It also should resist too early attempts at reconciliation, and of course resist any metaphysical theodicies of this being the best possible world, because social reality is obviously changeable. It should avoid fatalism and determinism and so on. And typically this critical approach criticizes the participatory approach from abstracting from power relations or inequalities and taking kind of pure ideal cases, and then sort of approach one's theory of social reality from these pure ideal cases. So rather, critical social ontology should focus on the nature of social reality as it is, because then you can guarantee that you don't abstract from power relations and inequalities if they are there. But this approach stresses also that we should avoid the illusion that social reality is easily changed. We should appreciate the coerciveness, that there is more to society than just individuals now. What is that? Good philosophical talks end at confusion, and I realized that I didn't fully understand my last bullet point, so this is a nice point to end. Thank you for your attention.